So, good morning, everyone. This morning, I want to talk about what I call the normalization of suffering as seen through the lens of Buddhism. And, I think I've mentioned this in the past, but one of the things that really captured my attention early on when I stumbled upon this practice was how it normalized the experience of suffering. I grew up believing that my suffering was a failure on my part, that somehow it was because I couldn't cope or was weak or defective. If I suffered, something was wrong with me. And I think many of us in our culture bought into that belief that suffering is somehow a failure. But the Buddha takes a very different position on it. First of all, he talks about the universality of suffering. No one escapes it. So, if it's a weakness, then it's one from which we all suffer. And, as we talked about on Wednesday, suffering is part of being vulnerable. I mean, it's part of our vulnerability. It's where that happens. And if we can talk about our vulnerability, we can talk about our suffering. But hearing that it was a normal part of the human experience was very liberating for me. It took this whole stigma off that I've been carrying around for years. And it's because the Buddha's perspective on it is very different from the message that Western culture promotes. His position is not only that does he normalize suffering, but in doing so removes the stigma often associated with it in Western culture. Because in the West, suffering is typically viewed as a failure. If you're suffering, it's your fault, you're not doing something right, or you're not coping well, whether it's personal suffering, social suffering, moral suffering, whatever. If someone is suffering, it is their fault or the result of poor choices that they've made. Now, not to say that that doesn't happen, but but beyond that, it's an unavoidable part of the human experience. And so because of that stigma that's attached to it in the West, we're sort of subtly encouraged to suppress or avoid or deny our suffering. And this, in turn, has us prioritizing external success, happiness, and comfort, putting our best face on everything, pretending we don't suffer, walking around like we've got our acts together, and so forth. But again, the Buddha talked about it as an inherent part of human existence. And he provided us with a practical framework for understanding and transcending it. At the very heart of his teaching, the first noble truth, the concept of dukkha, often translated as suffering, but that's too limited. It goes on to, unsatisfactoriness, unhappiness, minor frustrations, the list goes on and on. But it begins with the first noble truth. Life is suffering. It roughly translates as that. And it doesn't mean that life is only pain and misery. That's not what he's saying. But he's saying that things like dissatisfaction, impermanence, discomfort, unsatisfactoriness are inevitable parts of our human experience. Birth, aging, illness, death, separation from loved one, unfulfilled desires, on and on, are all forms of suffering. And by acknowledging that suffering is universal, and acknowledging that suffering is unavoidable, he normalizes it. It's not seen as a weakness, as a failure. It is not something to be feared, to be hidden, to be denied, but rather something to be understood and addressed. And this perspective, in my experience, sharply contrasts with the Western attitudes towards suffering, where suffering is seen as an anomaly or a problem to be fixed, or a weakness to be overcome. In Buddhism, suffering is not a sign of personal failure. It is a sign of shared human experience. And that perspective, that shift in perspective, fosters greater compassion, both for ourselves and others, because everyone is subject to struggles. Our struggles may be unique to us, an individual, but we're all struggling at some place. But again, in the West, this suffering is stigmatized. So people who experience mental health challenges, financial difficulties, personal losses, often feel isolated or judged or outcast because they feel they're not coping well, and everyone around them seems to have their act together. Part of what reinforces this is this cultural emphasis on the rugged individual and success at all costs, and having our act together, where suffering is a weakness or inadequacy in contrast. But in Buddhism, suffering is reframed as an opportunity for growth and transformation. The second noble truth talks about the cause of suffering as craving, tanha in the Pali, and attachment that arises from ignorance about the nature of reality, particularly the impermanence of all things. The impermanence is such a fundamental cause of much of our suffering when we cling to things that are going to change or go away. But when we understand the true causes of suffering, we begin to address it without shame, without self-blame, without perceiving it as some punishment by the universe or a flaw in our character, but as a natural consequence of clinging to impermanent things in the moment, in the big picture, in the little picture. The cessation of suffering is taught in the third noble truth, is letting go of our cravings and attachments. And then, of course, the fourth noble truth as the path, is the roadmap in the form of the Noble Eightfold Path. This is a practical approach which empowers us to take responsibility for our suffering, to meet it face to face without feeling stigmatized or helpless in the face of it. And this approach to suffering is so different from our Western culture. But because by normalizing it, it encourages more open conversation about it. We don't have to hide it as much. As we talked about on Wednesday with vulnerability, we can be more open about our pain, more open about our difficulty, more open about our vulnerability, which reduces the stigma about it with each other. A stigma surrounding emotional challenges, grief, self-doubt, and other forms of suffering. When suffering is seen as a natural part of life, we are more likely to seek help and support rather than hide our struggles. Because the tendency when we think it's a failure or a weakness, we feel ashamed of it and we want to hide it. But when we see it as a natural part of life, we're more likely to reach out for help and not feel like we have to hide it. Furthermore, our emphasis on mindfulness and self-awareness gives us practical tools for facing and dealing with our suffering. They help us observe our thoughts and emotions, especially those that involve suffering, without judgment. And what that does, it creates spaciousness around our suffering. It creates space for accepting it, for healing, for understanding it. And these practices, as you may know, because I talk about it here, has been integrated more and more into Western psychology, which has been, I think, tremendously beneficial to the whole field of mental health. One of the most transformative aspects of this on suffering is its emphasis on compassion. Recognizing that it is universal helps foster our empathy and our connection with others. I talked recently a little bit about the Bodhisattva ideal in Mahayana Buddhism. I mentioned it on Wednesday, which, this idea that the individual strives not only for their own liberation, but to alleviate the suffering of others. Think about how this contrasts with the Western focus on individual ego-based achievement and success, and the necessary stigmatization of suffering that follows from that individual ego-based, achievement-oriented set of values. The Buddhist approach offers a more collective and compassionate approach to life, which cultivates greater kindness and understanding toward ourselves and others. When we see suffering as a shared human experience, we are less likely to judge others for their suffering, which is a huge problem in our culture, or judge ourselves harshly. This leads to stronger relationships, greater emotional resilience, and a deeper sense of purpose. When we normalize suffering by seeing it as an inherent part of life, then we can begin moving toward lessening our suffering. this, with a great, more compassionate and practical approach to challenges. When we embrace our suffering as a teacher, not as an enemy, we find meaning, connection, and liberation. So in a world, in a culture that prioritizes superficial happiness, temporary happiness, fleeting happiness, the Buddha reminds us that true peace comes not from avoiding suffering, but from understanding it, facing it, and transforming it through the tools and the roadmap that he offered us. So those are some thoughts this morning on the normalization of suffering.